So sort of the latest trend or fad in poker, and then the latest evolution of it, is understanding game theory optimal play. So what exactly does game theory optimal play mean? Well, essentially what it means is you create a strategy that is unexploitable. So let's use a real life example. You all know rock, paper, scissors, right? You know, you throw rock, you throw paper, you throw scissors. Well, now what would be the game theory optimal percentage to throw each one? Right, I'll let you think about that for a second. Well, obviously, throwing 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 would be the game theory optimal approach. The problem with that is, while you won't lose, you also won't win if you stick to that. I mean, unless you get lucky, of course, but that's not an exploitative strategy. Now, what if you notice that your opponent throws rock a lot, right? You start to notice a pattern of he's throwing rock. Let's say he's throwing rock every time. Well, what should you do, right? So obviously you throw paper. But the question is, with poker, how often should you throw paper, right? Do you throw paper 100% of the time? That seems logical, right? The problem with that is if you start throwing paper 100% of the time, he notices and says, ha, I caught onto something you're doing, so I'm going to adjust as well, right? So what you want to do is instead of doing 33, 33, 33% across the board, if he's throwing, rock 100% of the time, you up your paper to maybe 40 or 45% of the time. So you're going to exploit the weakness in his strategy, but you're going to do it while he doesn't even realize you're doing it. Because every time you deviate from a game theory structure, you become exploitable as well. Another way to look at it really is so game theory is a defensive strategy. It ensures that I'm protected. There's no way that you're going to be able to exploit me. Now, exploitative play, which is something that I've been doing for 20 years before I fully had an understanding of game theory, is always looking for the mistakes in my opponent and going on the aggressive and trying to take advantage of them. Now, of course, a byproduct of that is, well, if they're being perceptive, they can start exploiting me because I'm willing to give up on the defensive side to play aggressively. So it's very important to have a mix of both, starting with a baseline of game theory and then exploiting from there. So there's a debate in poker, which is the better approach? Should we be focusing on playing strictly game theory optimal, or should we focus on playing strictly exploitative? And I think the right answer is somewhere in the middle, right? So you take what you can from game theory and then adjust to your opponents. Because if you're not doing that, you're not going to maximize profit. So for example, if you have player A who plays game theory in a game full of recreational players, player A is going to win. But if you're player B, right, and you're using some of that game theory, but you're also exploiting these weaker players, your win rate's going to be even bigger. So the combination, the hybrid, if you will, of game theory and exploitative play is what the elite players are going to do. One of the newer evolutions in poker is sort of understanding what a game theory baseline is. And when I say that, essentially what I'm saying is, what is the perfect play if you were playing against the perfect robot? Your opponent doesn't make any mistakes. What would be the standard or correct play in this situation? So it's become more and more increasingly important to know what that baseline is and then realize that, you know what? I'm not playing against a robot. These are humans. So what tendencies do they have? So let's say, for example, I'm in a situation where against the robot, well, I should bluff about 50% of the time. But I'm up against Harry. And Harry's a pushover, I can bluff Harry whenever I want to. So maybe against Harry, I up my frequency where I bluff 75% of the time, or maybe even 100 if I have a good read of the situation. So the important thing here is to understand that the math teaches you the baseline, so you know the right play, if you will, and then you deviate from that depending on your opponent and the history that you've developed with that player, because you'll always have a metagame. So if you sit down in a game and you just got caught bluffing 5 times in a row, okay, the jig is up, right? Because everyone's going to know now when they're in a situation to be like, you know what? I don't trust this guy because I've just seen him lie and bluff 5 times, so I'm going to call him. So you need to make the adjustments once you've done that. So there's a whole bunch of variables that would have you deviate from what sort of the baseline correct decision is based on history, player tendencies, and their impression of you. poker math, there's various levels of sort of the difficulty, and it's very important at the very least to understand sort of the beginner basic understanding of something as simple as pot odds, for example, right? So what are pot odds? Pot odds are simply like, what are the odds you're being laid? What is the price you're being given? So for example, if there's 100 in the pot and your opponent bets 100, what are your pot odds? Well, it's going to cost you 100 to win 200, right? So you're getting 2 to 1. So your pot odds are 2 to 1 or 33%. Now, typically when you're deciding, especially if you're on a draw type hand, whether or not you should continue, super important to understand the pot odds. So let's say, for example, you flopped 4 to a flush, okay? So that means you have 9 cards with which you can make your flush, okay? And a simple way for you to figure out percentages, because this is going to be important to you, is on the flop, however many outs you have, outs are cards that you need to help you, after the flop, multiply them by 4. If it's on the turn, you multiply it by 2. So in a situation on the flop where you have a flush draw, okay, that's 9 outs times 4, 36% chance, right? Which is roughly putting you at a 2 to 1 dog. Well, now you compare that to the size of the bet. So if there was 100 in the pot, your opponent bets 100, you're getting right about 2 to 1. So this is a situation where you might call. Now, what if that same opponent bet 500 into this $100 pot? What are your pot odds now? So now there's 600 in the pot, but it's going to cost you 500 to call, right? So now your pot odds aren't looking so good. You need to be getting 2 to 1 to make this call correct. Now, there's obviously a thing called implied odds, where if you think that you catch your sneaky card, you can get a whole big stack of chips from your opponent. It might be worth it sometimes to take bad odds with the hopes of getting a big payday after. But in that direct moment, say, for example, you had no other chips, would it be correct to call with the flush draw? And the answer is no, because your odds are 36%, as we said, but you're having to risk now 500 to win 600, which doesn't give you the right price. So as I said, there's different levels of poker math, and there's another one that I think is pretty important to understand as sort of a game theory baseline, and that's what should be the correct folding frequency, right? So what does that mean exactly? Well, it means based on a bet size, how often should you theoretically be folding? So for example, there's 100 in the pot, and your opponent bets 100. Well, in theory, long term, how often should you call? And there's actually a formula that you can use and do in real time, because it's very important with all the study that we do here that it's applicable to real time situations. There's not a lot of value in saying to yourself, well, I figured it out at home, but when you need to actually do it in the moment. So one of the very, very simple formulas that we're going to look at right here is it's bet divided by pot plus bet. And that's going to be your fold frequency. So in this case, that would be 100 over 100 plus 100, which is 100 over 200, which you can break down to 1 over 2, which is 50%. So in this situation, if your opponent bets pot, theoretically, you should fold 50% of the time and either call or raise the other 50% of the time. Now let's take a look at another situation. Let's say there's 100 in the pot, but your opponent bets 300 this time. So what should your fold frequency be in this case? Okay? So we have the 300 up top, and then down low we have the pot plus bet, which is 300 plus 100. So that's 300 over 400, breaks down to 3 over 4, which we know breaks down to 75%. So you should be folding to a bet size that big 75% of the time. So that means that only the top 25% of the range of hands that you have should you call with in this situation. And this is a very easily applicable mathematical formula that you can use that is absolutely correct in all situations that can help you at least know, okay, so, well, how often should I fold? And then decide from there, should I fold more often because this guy doesn't bluff? Or should I call more often maybe because this guy bluffs too much? Or maybe my hand is too strong to fold. Maybe I almost have the nuts, which is the best hand possible. So even if I should fold 75% of the hands, I have a hand that's way too good to fold. So the key thing is knowing what is the correct frequency and then adjusting from there based on the situation. So let's have you guys try one right now, okay? Let's do this formula. Say, for example, there is 400 in the pot, and your opponent bets 100. What's the correct fold frequency? Is it A, 20%, B, 25%, or C, 15%? So if you said 20%, you would be correct. Now, I think it's really important, this is some homework for you, when you're playing poker and you're in situations, I want you to start with this thought process first. Let's figure out what is your folding frequency, and even if you're going to fold, just as a practice, because what we want to do is we want to get to what's called stage 4 it, where just you automatically know. It's like, oh, pot size bet, yeah, I'm supposed to fold 50% of the time. He bets 3x pot, all right, 75. You want it to be that fast so that you can not waste all your time in that moment focusing on that, and you can really study the player and everything else that you need to think about in terms of the variables of the hand.